Welcome to the Meeteetse Museums and our exhibit on the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is of course most famous for Yellowstone National Park, which does form kind of the heart of the ecosystem, but the area really spans 30,000 square miles, more than that actually. And geology is the basis of the ecosystem, as any ecosystem. Because of Yellowstone's volcanic nature, you'll see a lot of kind of volcanic formations throughout the area, and that shapes a lot of kind of the plant and fauna here in the area. We're home to more than 1,500 native species, and they've adapted to a really short growing season, which makes them unique from other species in different areas. We have white bark pine, which can live for up to 700 years, sagebrush, which you'll see everywhere, and Indian paintbrush, which is kind of a very famous flower for the West. But wildlife is perhaps better known. Grizzly bears, of course, like little Wahb behind me, and we have Big Joe here, are very famous. They historically ranged from Alaska all the way down to Mexico, and in 2019 there were 700 here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Grizzlies have large claws which they use for digging up roots, and they also, here in Wyoming, will dig up moths. Believe it or not, they will feast on moths in August. They retreat to above timberline, and they'll eat up to 40,000 moths, miller moths, a day, which are kind of this nutritious snack high in fat, which they need to stock up on before their hibernation. These fearsome animals aren't always the best hunters. They can move pretty fast when they want to, but compared to things like elk, and other animals here in the ecosystem, they're not the fastest. And so a lot of times, instead of killing themselves, they will just forage on other killed animals. And so a lot of times, you know, in hunting season, things like that, we have to take extra precautions here in Wyoming to make sure that the kills are properly disposed of so that they're not attracting grizzlies to areas where hikers are going to be going past and causing some human conflict with that. You'll also see the gray wolf here behind me. They're also known as the timber wolf, and they can weigh up to 175 pounds, and in the wild they typically live about 3 years. They have very rough lives. They like to have large hoofed animals as their prey, so elk, mule deer, things like that. They hunt in packs, and they can take down full-grown elk and bison in their pack formations. And historically, their range covered 2/3 of the United States, so they were a very common animal. But in 2019, there were an estimated 500 gray wolves in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In the 1800s, settlers began to expand westward from the East Coast, and this westward expansion brought them into contact with wildlife, such as grizzly, wolves, and also other things like elk. The elk were really good game meat, and so their populations declined because of hunting, but then the grizzly bears and the wolves posed a threat to settler livelihood, their cattle. Meeteetse is well known for cattle ranching. We have an entire segment of the museum really dedicated to ranching, and when grizzly bears and wolves found out that there was this slower prey item on the landscape, they took advantage of it, and as a result, some settlers came into contact with the grizzly bears and the wolves quite often. Cash prizes were placed on how many wolves or grizzly bears could be brought in. And this is because in 1910, the death of a full-grown cow cost a landowner $6.60. And by 1920, the death of the same full-grown cow would cost about $13.30. So the average income in the United States at that time is about $3,000. So you can imagine that the death of one cow is a huge impact on the livelihood of that settler. At the turn of the century, because there was so much predation and so much conflict with ranchers, there was hardly any wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And by 1926, the last wolf pack in Yellowstone National Park was removed from the landscape. And so this made for several years without wolves on the landscape. And what this did was cause an overabundance of elk. And eventually the elk were damaging the vegetation. The grizzly bear fared better than the wolf. Their population was also in a steady decline. They lost a lot of their habitat, and they kind of range a substantial amount, and so one grizzly bear needs a decent amount of habitat. And by the 1930s, the population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem was isolated, as they still are today. And by 1975, there were fewer than 200 grizzly bears in the ecosystem. And while ranchers and livestock owners learned how to coexist with these grizzly bears in their reduced numbers, in the park, the effects of the absence of the wolf was becoming apparent. The vegetation was suffering. In result, trout and things were having problems, and so there was this whole cascade effect. And so it was proposed to reintroduce the wolf. And as you can imagine, this was very controversial. One of the women from Meeteetse, Lucille Moon Hall, wrote a letter to the Cody Enterprise editor, and her objection was that my prayers and hopes are that this idea of reintroduction of those savage, ruthless creatures will never see the light of day. No wild horned animal will survive hamstringing other creatures and leaving them to die while they converge on another animal just to bring an animal down and leave it to die a death of suffering. And so there was this thought that wolves will just kind of move through killing things and not actually kill and eat their prey, and that they'll just be kind of on a killing spree. But wolves were reintroduced. And they had a moment where they had to get used to their new area. They came down from Jasper National Park in Canada. So they killed twice as many elk as expected from 1995 to 2003. 256 sheep and 41 cattle were also officially designated as wolf kills during that time period in the areas surrounding the park. And they began to increase their population, and in correspondence, the protection on wolves also changed and decreased. So they weren't protected by 2016. They were completely delisted as of 2016. And at the same time, grizzly bears have been increasing in population. So by 2017, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service felt that the grizzlies didn't need their protections, and they removed them from the endangered species list. But neither the grizzlies or the wolves can be hunted in the park because of federal regulations. And so in this land surrounding the park, it's up to each state whether they can be hunted. And some celebrated this delisting, hoping that the grizzlies could be hunted, which would allow them to show more fear of humans and not be so bold. They can be quite bold at times. But there was also a massive pushback, and so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service faced 6 lawsuits over the delisting of grizzly bears. One lawsuit was issued by the Crow tribe in Montana. And as of September 2018, the delisting was ruled illegal by a federal judge, and they were relisted, so no hunting took place in that brief year that they were considered a non-endangered species. As of 2019, they remained on the endangered species listing, but wolves are no longer listed, and there's an estimated 700 grizzlies and estimated 500 gray wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the existence of both still causes debate. Are they helpful to the ecosystem? Does it help to have these apex predators on the landscape, or is it a problem? Where does kind of the intersection between humans and livestock, but also wildlife that was here for thousands of years, where does that kind of come from? And so this area of the museum dives into that debate. We give you lots of facts about these animals, but also things like bison, elk. And so what do you think? Let us know.